Hello, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Personal Transformation Experience podcast. My name is David Brand. With me is my wife, Maureen Brand.
Hello.
And today we are talking about the impact of parental mental health conditions on their children, not just when they're children, but also later in life into adulthood. I'm really excited to kind of talk about this. I think both of us have had an impact from our parents' own struggles with mental health conditions. And there's a lot to unpack there in terms of, what we experience as children, but the lasting impact and how we led our adult lives as a result of that impact.
Right.
So I think this ties back way back in the early days of our podcast, September, October of last year. It feels like we've been doing this for a very long time. We talked about adverse childhood experiences, and you can go out to cdc.org and other great resources. Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, former Attorney General of the state of California. Attorney General.
I believe so.
So look her up too, because she's done a lot of work around this. But when you look at adverse childhood experiences, one of the questions to assess what they call your ACEs score is, did you live with anyone who was depressed, mentally ill, or attempted suicide? I can definitely check that box. My mother had bipolar depression, and she attempted suicide at least twice when I was a child. And then the other question is, did you live with anyone who had a problem with drinking or using drugs, including prescription drugs? I can definitely check that box. My mother also had a alcohol use disorder and also did both illegal and prescription drugs. How about you?
My dad was an alcoholic for sure. And I believe it was as a result of his generalized anxiety. He had severe anxiety.
Was he diagnosed with that formally, though?
Interestingly enough, no.
It doesn't mean it's not valid.
I remember my mom, because I was always wondering, why was, when I got to be an adult, I was like, why was Dad like that? What was wrong? What happened to him? And she kind of gave me a little bit of a history of his parents and him, what she knew of him. And then she used to say, when he got out of work, because he was a cop in the Bronx back in the 60s,
That alone, you say cop in the Bronx, and for those people not familiar with New York, Bronx is one of the boroughs of New York, but that sounds like a tough job.
He was there during the Bronx riots, and everything. And he just...
Was he a cop during the blackouts of 1977?
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. It was. Yeah, it was rough, and I know that it affected him a lot. He didn't know how to deal with it. He drank a lot as a result. Not that that's an excuse, but that's what he did. He used to run. He got me into running. He ran. He got into exercise, and he also would play darts incessantly for hours and hours.
Interesting.
While
drinking, though, right?
Yeah.
I think you told me this.
I don't know if he was drinking, but I know we had a dartboard in the basement, and he would go down after work, he'd work 4 to 12s, get home at 12, and be throwing darts till 3 o'clock in the morning just to unwind, I guess. My mom used to, because I was like, she would say he would be down there for hours throwing darts.
Wow.
And I thought to myself, as I grew up later, I was realizing that must have been a way for him to kind of calm his central nervous system so that he could sleep. People have these things, this repetitive behavior, whatever it was. And he later told me he suffered from anxiety. But just kind of mentioning it, he didn't really talk much about it. I did ask him, about his mom, because his mom died when he was in his early 20s, and his dad, and he would never talk about it. And he actually got nasty with me for kind of pushing it and asking him questions. So something happened there that I never was able to kind of understand, or, I wish I knew. He was an only child.
Yeah.
And both his parents died, so I don't really know what really happened, but...
That's so interesting, because my mother was an only child as well.
Yeah. What really, I think, tipped me off about I could kind of put the pieces together, was when he died, I had all of his records and stuff, and I was looking at his old report cards. First of all, he went to the Russian Orthodox Church and Russian Orthodox school, private schools, I think. And he also went to a trade school. And you could see his grades were very poor. And I would imagine if he had some kind of learning disability
undiagnosed,
that was undiagnosed, some kind of like even developmental delay, something
right,
was going on, because he was not normal. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, he didn't behave typically
Yeah.
in social situations. I could tell you that.
right,
That he, I think he was abused or beaten for having bad grades, thinking he was just lazy. But he might have had ADHD, he might have a learning disability.
right.
And I remember him also telling me when he went to college to do some criminal, take some criminal classes, criminal science classes. My mother basically wrote all of his papers. So that was, I was like, why? You know, I mean, I get that he was working, you know, and he needed help, but I think it was more than that. And so also the way he talked, and as I became more educated as an adult, you know, and I started seeing like the way he spoke and kind of I could start detecting his deficits based on my own education experience. So I think that he was self-medicated. You know, he started self-medicating as a young man, and how he dealt with it, which unfortunately is what happens when you don't get diagnosed.
Absolutely. I mean, I think my mother being an only child, I know her mother had very high expectations for her, and there's nothing wrong with a parent having high expectations for their children, as long as your expectations are not their expectations, right? I mean, it's one thing to encourage your child to be the best that they can be based on their own definition of success and what that looks like versus the parents, right? And when the parent this is what you need to do, right? This is our definition of success for you, and you must follow this. That's where I think trouble brews, and that may be the case. I'm not 100% sure. None of my grandparents or my mother now are alive today to investigate further, but I do know that she graduated in 1962 from high school, so it was a time where things were starting to change in the country. There was a little bit of angst going on. And, you know, I remember when I was a small child, she would sing me folk songs. She was very much into Pete Seeger and Joan Baez. And, you know, I think she really idolized Joan Baez. And she drew. She was a painter. She played the guitar. She sang. She wrote her own songs. She sang folk songs to me. I mean, I do remember her singing songs like Puff the Magic Dragon to me or Blowing in the Wind when I was very small. And this was, you know, the more bohemian type lifestyle that my mother emulated. But I know my grandmother was very dismissive of that. And, you know, my mother, I don't know the exact story, but I know my mother went to UMass, University of Mass at Amherst, and maybe made it a semester. And I think she was, as I was told, kicked out in the second semester. And then she went to Drew University in New Jersey to study liberal arts. And then she didn't finish that either. And then she ended up meeting my father. I think she was only 20 years old. She was barely 21 when they married. So not really sure what happened there, but then she had me immediately after. She was 22, right? So you have this arc, right? She graduates high school at 18, and she's going to a prestigious university right out of college, and then really within 4 years she has a baby and she's married, right? So her whole life kind of changed, and I think what she really wanted was to be an artist or a musician, and her parents were against that. So I think there was something there that set her up now for a long time I didn't get to be who I wanted to be.
Right. She couldn't be her true self. She couldn't be who she was.
And now she got locked in because now she had children. My sister was born 5 years after I was, you know, and eventually, you know, my parents separated when I was 8, and my mother went through, you know, multiple relationships, another marriage. It didn't even last a year. And you know, it was a very chaotic life for me, right? We were moving constantly. I didn't know who she was going to bring home. I didn't know who my mother was going to be from day to day.
Well, so it's so funny. Let me just like go back a little bit to the music of the times, Joan Baez and Bob Seger and these artists who
Pete
were
Seeger,
Pete Seeger, I'm sorry, who spoke these folks, this folk music, spoke directly to that emotional turmoil and trauma of the times, right? So not only did it speak to the milieu of the country, but it spoke to young individuals, young adults who were in some kind of plight in life, having some challenge and struggling and trying to work through that. So I think you also told me that later in life, she would sing these songs to you because she's been trying to work this out, because these songs were kind of like on a replay going around and around. And she was trying to work something out that she couldn't quite process and get through and work through.
I don't think she ever did. No.
Yeah, no, because, and it's just interesting because I remember listening to those songs, especially when we watched that movie last night about Bob Dylan.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah, it made me think a lot
really
about
does.
her.
I could see your mom now doing that. Now I kind of put the pieces together. Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right. And just to back up a little bit around some data too. I mean, and I looked this up, and we'll share these in the notes too. This is from the National Institute of Health. 1 in 5 minor children has at least one parent with a mental illness, and this can impair the psychosocial development of the offspring. And the psychological burden of parental mental illness not only leads to emotional behavioral difficulties in children, but has a more general influence on the children's social relationships, their interests, academic environment, and affect the children's overall well-being and life satisfaction. But I don't believe, and I think there's many studies that show that the impact of parental mental illness is not automatic or predictable, right? You can't say, well, if the parent is bipolar, the child will turn out like this, right? Because we're all kind of genetically different and we respond differently.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it depends on the child's own level of resiliency.
Yeah.
The other caregivers in their life, thank you to my mother's grandmother who was always looking out for me, and other influencers like adults that come into your life.
Yeah, I mean, I know, like, when I listen to Gabor Mate, who is kind of like a guru when it comes to trauma and childhood trauma, he does speak directly to how childhood trauma affects young people. And what did he say? I wrote this great quote down earlier. So we pass on to our offspring what we haven't resolved in ourselves. Yeah. And so when I think about childhood trauma, I think about how it affected my ability to respond as an adult, my ability to make good decisions, and stay safe and engage in healthy relationships.
It's definitely the same for me.
So, yeah, I mean, it really does affect those things. So as you develop and grow, it changes the way your brain develops, right? Yeah. And there's something, a cortisol response. So cortisol is a hormone that we all need in our bodies, and it's typically high in the morning, so it wakes us up, and we want that. Mm-hmm. We want it to wake us up and get us moving. That's what cortisol does. It's almost like a pick-me-up. Yep. But when cortisol is chronically high your entire day, it can start to affect, like, it's supposed to bring you, you're not supposed to have really very little cortisol in your body by the end of the night, by the end of the day.
Yeah, otherwise you wouldn't be able to fall asleep.
You wouldn't fall asleep, and then melatonin kicks in, the lights go down, and the body naturally produces melatonin so you could sleep. Yeah. But when you have childhood trauma, that cortisol level over time, that's chronic, the cortisol level doesn't go down. It stays the same. So it really was developed, and if you look at our ancestors, you're running from the tiger in the bush. Well, it sounds like you're in
overdrive, right? Is the way I think about it. Yeah,
you're in overdrive. So you're ready to run from the tiger in the bush, right? So that's really what it was for. Mm-hmm. We got this kick of cortisol, and we just took off. Life-saving situation, making sure our child doesn't get eaten by the tiger, the whole thing. So, and that's just kind of part of human development. But as you go to, you go to your cave at night, and you come, you're safe now, generally speaking.
Right.
And so it goes down. So when you have this chronic trauma, it stays, and it affects the way the brain develops. So now the child's always in fight or flight mode. And now as an adult, what happens? In order to calm down, in order to feel like you're normal, because you always feel like you're in fight or flight mode, you do a few different things. You drink, you self-medicate, or you go to therapy, you get diagnosed, you get some medicine, and you take, you try to exercise, meditate, and go that route. But unfortunately, many people don't do that. And they end up taking the self-medication route and developing these maladaptive behaviors.
Yeah, and I can certainly attest to that. I mean, my mother was diagnosed with manic depressive bipolar disorder when I was about 12. She had remarried just before my 12th birthday, and it really all this kind of reared its ugly head, and that's where I kind of saw the worst of what my mother went through around that time. Shortly after she married her second husband, we moved, and I knew something was off. Right, I'm 12 years old, and as things are coming off the moving truck, my stepfather is saying that my mother's things are going into the front bedroom, his things are going into the back bedroom. So I'm like, okay, why there's a couple that just got married within the last 12 months setting up for separate bedrooms, right? So things deteriorated pretty quickly. And actually, once they moved in, my mother ended up staying in bed for at least 3 months. She didn't eat. She lost 50 pounds. I didn't know to that point what severe and clinical depression looked like, but I know now as an adult what it looks like. And my stepfather was completely overwhelmed. Ultimately, my grandmother had to come up, as she did many times, to help around the house. And then that time and other times, she actually took us with her, my sister and I, to her home in New Jersey for weeks at a time, especially when we were out of school in the summer or holidays. We moved again and again after that. I watched her go from extreme drug and alcohol fueled highs to extremely depressive lows. I remember her sitting at the table crying, telling me all about her boyfriend issues and chain smoking while drinking drink after drink until she passed out. And I didn't make the connection till later. I mean, much later. Thank you, Mel D. Beatty, for writing Codependent No More, which I read in my 20s. But, a lot of the patterns in my relationships after that were as a helper, right? My first very major relationship, someone that I married, they had an eating disorder, but I saw it as my job, my role to help them, to fix them, right? I was their savior in a way, right? That some divine intervention put me in their path, right? So I could help them, resolve their eating disorder, right? Because I couldn't fix my mother. So
you got to fix somebody. Yeah.
So I became a people fixer, and in fact, I used to make comments to people that to me, people were like old radios, right? I don't know who were listening remembers transistor radios. I love to take them apart and tinker with them. So I always thought, well, people were like that. I could take them apart, figure them out, kind of put them back together, right, in a better way. Right. And somehow that was my job to do that. And it wasn't, right? It took me years to learn it's not my job to help other people, right, fix themselves. You can't. And second to that, I got into this role where I was always, and even today, it's hard because I feel like I'm overly sensitive to people's reactions, right? And I'm trying to manage, and I had a stepmother that had a lot of emotional turmoil also, and I lived with my father and stepmother at several junctures in my life. And my father was like, well, you have to be careful around her. Watch what you say, watch what you do. Don't say this, don't say that. When you said this to her yesterday, well, she took it this way. And so I constantly got in this mode of, oh my God, I have got every single thing that somebody does, it's my fault, right? If somebody is having a bad day, it's me. It's my fault. So at work, if somebody says, hey, I heard this happened, I'm like, oh, it's all my fault. I'm a terrible person. I should just quit my job, right? So I go from whatever the reverse of 0 to 60 is, right? I go the other way down this hole. Yeah. And I have to go home and talk to you or meditate or whatever to get back to baseline, right? Because I'm so easily brought back to that place where it's my job to manage everybody's reactions and emotions.
Right, but that's a part, right? So the thing, I mean, look, I went through a lot of stuff, and we're gonna talk about that in another episode because what you went through and what I went through is like a whole book.
Right. Well, I wrote a book. If you care to know,
The Everything Kid. It's amazing.
Kid. It's out on Amazon, David Michael Brand. But and I wrote a lot about this, and I probably should go back in and re-edit it because I've learned so much.
You need to put a link in the bio
I wrote this book 6 years ago, and I feel like I've learned 1,000 things since then.
It's true. But what was a lifesaver for me is ART, two kinds of trauma therapy. ART was accelerated resolution therapy.
Definitely.
And what that does is it has you sort of revisit the event in a safe way, process it, because ideally trauma is unprocessed experiences that were difficult, right?
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily trauma if the child was not alone with the experience, with the emotions of the experience, and was
Yeah.
able to process it appropriately,
Yeah.
right? It becomes traumatic when it stays in the body and the child is not able to process the event that was scary or difficult.
Yeah.
And then
Get stuck.
they get stuck.
Get stuck.
So, and then you get like the people pleasing behavior.
Right.
Right. Which I had too. But ART did it. And also IFS, internal family
Which
systems.
I've done too. You far more than me.
Yeah.
But love it.
I mean, you know, I resonated with internal family systems in such an amazing way because it allowed me to realize that it wasn't me, it was the parts. So as you grow and develop and you have these experiences, parts show up of your person, parts of who you are, yourself, show up and they protect you from certain things. They're like, okay, this happened. We're going to make sure we don't get into a situation where this happens again. So you develop these behaviors from this part to protect you. And then when you become an adult, now you're sort of sidestepping things that you don't want to deal with, or, you know, that could potentially affect your career, how you parent, and the relationships that you have and how you behave in those relationships. So now you have these parts that have been traumatized that are living inside your body and they're like avoiding situations, right?
Right.
So one might might keep you from getting close in a relationship, avoid intimacy, right? So just sex, no intimacy, right? So don't be intimate, don't get close, and as soon as you do, you do things to sabotage. Stay like in a professional world. If you always were told that you're stupid and everything that comes out of your mouth is stupid, then guess what you're not going to do? You're not going to speak in front of people.
Right.
You're going to be afraid to talk and voice your opinions and voice your ideas because there's a part of you that's going to stop you from doing that so that you don't get yelled at, hit, beat.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
So these are the things that I developed in later in life. And so IFS allows you to identify that part, talk to that part, and let that part know that, guess what? I'm all grown up now. We're all grown up. I've got this. You know, I'll keep you safe. Right? And I mean, that's just a small, like, sort of clip of how it works. But you focus on the part, the emotion will bring you to that part. And then you talk to that part and you let that part know that they don't have to protect you anymore, that you're not a child. Chances are that part still thinks you're still 5 or 6 or however old you were when it developed or you experienced the trauma. And it really works well. You have to visit your parts almost daily. I do that daily through meditation. So I meditate. I try to meditate twice a day, if not once. 10 minutes. You touch base with your parts and you let them know you're still, because they have to build trust, right? So that part that had an anxiety attack, that part that would have a panic attack, or that part that would keep you from going further in your relationship is the one that you want to reach.
Yeah.
And let them know that it's okay, that they're safe.
No, I totally
And
agree.
it was a total game changer for me.
Yeah, and I think this is a practice, right? I don't think there's any nirvana here, right?
No, it's not easy.
You have to keep working at this.
Yeah.
And we're going to have, I reflected on some difficulties at work last week, and I think the end of the day is sometimes we have a bad day, or we have a bad week, or, I hate to use the word bad or good, right? Because that's subjective. It was a challenging week, right? But the challenging times that I had at work, they don't define me as an individual, as a leader, or challenging times at home define you as a parent, unless you let that be your definition, right? It can be, this was a challenging experience. It doesn't mean I'm a challenging person, or I'm a bad leader, or I'm a bad parent, right? We can tell ourselves those stories. And so when you have challenging experiences and you put them all together and say, this defines who I am, that is when you're going to move backwards, right? And not move forward. So I think it's really like, okay, I had a challenging experience, or I had challenging experiences at work this week. What did I learn from them, and what am I going to do different in the future as a result of what I learned?
Yes.
When people come to me and say, hey, I screwed up and made a mistake, I'm like, okay, what happened? What did you learn from it? And what are you going to do differently now?
All right. How do you change your behaviors?
Right. How do you change, the
Or
thing
your
is,
response.
obviously if you don't learn from anything and don't take the time to reflect and look for that learning and look for that pivot and shift, right, then you're going to keep making the same mistake. And if you keep crashing your car over and over again, they cancel your insurance. So
Right.
you do have to kind of make sure,
Yeah.
right? And I think the other thing with me that I've really recognized too is don't go too fast, right? I think, when you're in that people pleasing space, like I got to do this and I got to do that and I got to make this person happy, and next thing you're going 90 miles an hour. But like, again, using the car analogy, 90 miles an hour, deer runs out in front of you, kid runs out in front of you, car comes out in front of you. You're going to hit it because you don't have enough reaction time. So,
Right. You need to put space between you and your response to.
But you also just in general, you have to slow down.
Yes,
right? That's
you
the
do.
meditation part, right? It takes your brain out. If your brain's in hyperspeed, the best thing you can do is meditate for a half an hour, right? And stop.
Or at least 10 minutes.
Stop the speeding, right? Because if your brain's
Right.
going, right? I mean, you've got to. And what I need to do, I know some people at work walk around the pond. I need to do that. I just need to step out and get out of the office and stop. I need to give myself a time out.
Well, carve that time out and take it.
Intentionally and saying, you know what, I can't have this meeting. I can't work through lunch.
Don't be like, oh my God, I have 10 people trying to text me at the same time.
It's the way I'm organizing
Let
my
it go.
day.
Right.
Right. I don't need to respond to every email.
No.
I don't need to respond to every text.
You don't even have to acknowledge it.
Right.
I think when you acknowledge it is when
I feel the need to be super responsive, though.
Right.
Back to childhood.
the pleasing piece, the people pleasing
And
piece.
if I'm not responsive,
Right.
then something's going to fall apart. My parent might fall apart.
Right.
Or they're going to
Right.
hit me or scream at me. Right.
Right.
So,
Right. So that's where you not just meditate, but you do the parts work.
Right.
Because when you recognize that you're running and you feel chaotic, when you feel chaotic, you have to recognize that feeling. And that will stop the train before it leaves the station.
That's the problem with me. Once the train's left the station.
Yeah.
Somebody made a comment at work too about people who are really smart, right, but can't stop themselves, right? And I think, maybe they were talking about me, but I might resemble that remark at times. But I think it was a Maserati engine with bicycle brakes. I think might have been the analogy, right?
Yep.
So I think, right, I do not
I
put
would use
myself
that
on a
to
pedestal.
describe you sometimes.
Pretty smart, but I don't always know how to stop myself. Don't always know how to
Right.
filter myself.
Right.
Sometimes, so I take on too much or say the wrong thing.
Yeah.
And I'm super aware of it. It's not for a lack of, hey, I have this blind spot. I wouldn't even call it a blind spot.
But it's after
I'm
the fact.
100% aware.
But not in the
of it.
moment. It's the awareness in the moment.
I would say sometimes even in the moment, I'm like,
But you still can't stop.
I definitely should have not have said that. And I know it right away.
Oh,
right? And then
after.
I start
Immediately
apologizing to
after.
people and over explaining myself
That's worse,
and
yeah.
oversharing, right?
That's worse, yeah.
When it's like, oh, I know I shouldn't have said that, everything, like, and I don't know if the other person really wants to hear all that, but
No, it makes everybody uncomfortable. Just
it's cringe
dismiss
moments.
it. Yeah.
But, I know you got some notes out about some of the things that, how childhood trauma affects you in adulthood.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we've talked about some of this. I think there's some key highlights here. So again, how trauma affects you as an adult, increased sensitivity to stress, right? So you talked about that heightened stress, cortisol response, difficulties in relationship. So you have difficulties forming a healthy relationship or have difficulties with trust, intimacy, and attachment. Obviously, increased risk of substance use.
Right.
Right. So I dealt with that most of my life. We did talk on here in January about how I gave up drinking. Difficulty with emotional regulation.
Right.
I'm definitely in that camp, right? Increased irritability, anxiety, depression. So, and then if I'm emotionally dysregulated and I'm a leader of other people, if I'm emotionally dysregulated, other people see it, they feel it, they sense it, they know it. And then groups of people become dysregulated and we're not getting things done effectively. Chronic disease is a big one. Are my back issues related to this? Probably in part. Yes, did I not lift things correctly? But also I think The Body Keeps the Score, great book. Again, a lot of these things live in our body. But going back to ACEs, right?
Which was the tie-in. That's
Right.
why I think she really delved into the ACEs big, in that way to do the research on how these scores, this childhood trauma affects your health as an adult and how it ties into chronic diseases like anti-inflammatory and
cancer
and
right.
autoimmune disorders,
Autoimmune disorders
is a
right.
big one.
And I was
Autoimmune
diagnosed
disorders.
with one, sarcoidosis,
Right.
when I was 34,
Right.
which is an autoimmune disorder.
Right.
It is apparently not active right now, but it is something that comes up in people that have that trauma.
Yep. And like psoriatic arthritis
That's right.
is a big one. So yeah, I remember and then high blood pressure, high cholesterol,
Oh, 100%.
anxiety, mood disorders.
And some of those things, there's, they're because people smoke and they're because people drink, right? Liver issues, lung issues.
Right.
So you find like lung and liver issues in people that have a lot of trauma, but they also smoke and drink, right? So
we're just trying to mitigate the effects, the anxiety and stuff. I mean,
right. So you're trying to get something to kind of pacify and self-medicate, but it ends up causing other issues that require medication, and you're in this loop. But you talked about intergenerational trauma. I know you brought up Gabor Mate. The Myth of Normal, by the way, is a great book. I read it 6 months ago. He talks a lot about that in The Myth of Normal. But I know you have followed Gabor Mate a lot. I mean, how have you found that to be impactful for you, kind of reading his work?
Well, because he puts it in such great perspective. It really helps you understand that it is multi-generational, right? You look at your own family, you look at your parents and how they grew up and the choices that they made, and it gives you some perspective. Yeah. Right? And you realize, okay, because as a child, you're egocentric, so everything is your fault. No matter what happens, it is your fault. Like the child will think that
your parents
automatically.
Break up. It's
right.
my
Everything
fault,
is on you. So, and as you get older, you realize it's not, but that's why it's so important to address that as a parent with a child. But that said, I mean, he says we pass on to our offspring what we haven't resolved ourselves. And this is so true. Left unhealed, trauma has an impact on your life, about how you feel about yourself. I said this earlier, how you see the world, how you get triggered, what you believe about yourself, and the kind of relationships you have with yourself and others. So yeah, you will, if the voice in your head is critical and you're awful, you're a bad person, you're stupid, all these things. Well, not only that, so that's going to be something that you pass on to your own child, either by telling them, right? When your child behaves in a way that triggers you, guess what you're going to do? That ugly voice in your head is going to speak straight to your child. Unless you resolve it, unless you realize, okay, this is a part of me that's being triggered by my child. Because we have children, we think, I'm going to have a child because, I want to complete my life. I want to have something to pass on. But children will trigger every single part of you. Oh, yeah. That has a trigger. Absolutely. Right. They are the greatest triggers that you'll ever have. And so we have to remember that. So everything that happened to us as a child, our child's going to trigger in us. Yeah, absolutely. Unless we start parenting from the inside out, which is a great book. Also, another great book. Daniel Siegel, who wrote that?
I'm not sure.
I'll have to look it up.
So the takeaway that I'd want to convey to anybody watching is, think back to your parent. Maybe their condition was not diagnosed, or you weren't aware of it. Think back to what kind of symptoms, what kind of behaviors did they display, right? And then kind of do some research and find out maybe your parent had a mental health condition that wasn't diagnosed. Right. Or some other condition that led to a mental health condition, right? Like a learning disability that led to other mental health conditions like anxiety, right? Severe generalized anxiety because they couldn't read or couldn't communicate with people. See, it's interesting to make those connections, because then you want to see, okay, what is showing up in my life and my behavior, right? And what is a connection to those conditions? And once you're more aware of that connection, I don't think it's absolutely 100% necessary to be aware of that connection. But once you have it, it kind of helps, because then you can look at internal family systems therapy, going a little bit more into it. Yeah. Like, okay, so my parent behaved this way. This protector part came out of that experience. But now I'm the sturdy adult. I'm the internal sturdy adult leader, right? I can tell that part. We got it, right? But I think the more you can be aware of how number one, be aware of your own behavior, self-aware, and then kind of think to, hey, where did that develop? Where did that come from? Right. I think it helps you unravel the mystery.
Yeah.
Right. And solve the problem.
Well, that's what it does. It gives you perspective. It really gives you some understanding and compassion towards your parent, especially if you are not happy with them. Like you have some sort of strained relationship. But I think there are a few things that you can do right now in the moment when you feel triggered or anxious. You can go out in nature, take a walk, get outside. Just being outside in nature where it's quiet, you can hear the birds sing, will calm the vitamin D. But the sounds, being out in the fresh air and being in nature, if you can get out there, will calm your central nervous system. Get grounded.
Absolutely.
Make sure you just rub your thighs or rub your feet on the floor. Your bare feet on the floor will ground you. Anything to ground you. Look around. Use your senses. Smell, touch, see, feel to ground yourself.
Of course, yeah.
And take some deep breaths. I know that's like overrated, but it really does. When you take a deep breath and you count to 4 and you exhale to 4 and you put your tongue up behind your teeth, on the roof of your mouth behind your teeth, it kind of calms everything. It does. It absolutely will help to calm you down. Yeah. And it takes about, 15, 20 seconds. It's not hard. No. So you could do those things. But again, if you really feel like triggered, like walk away. Right. From the situation so you can get yourself calm and just say, if it's safe, do that. Right. Oh, I love it. It was good stuff. Yeah. I did enjoy preparing and doing this episode with you. So good. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments. I do encourage you to like our podcast if you found benefit from it, and follow us, subscribe to us. We also have an Instagram page called Personal Transformation EXP, where we put some information reels and we share information from other people that have inspired us. Certainly Dick Schwartz, Internal Family Systems, Andrew Huberman, Mel Robbins, Esther Perel, Mark Brackett, Martha Beck, Jefferson Fisher, Dr. Becky, Gaber Mate, and I realize I don't think we've been sharing his information on our site, so we need to start doing that. Resources. And definitely check out The Everything Kid. It's a great book. It's about the story of a little boy who felt like he had to be everything to everybody. Thanks again. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.